Hello, dear loved ones. The first settlement. In December of 1620, a small group of English pilgrims arrived on the shores of what is now known as Plymouth, Massachusetts, aboard the Mayflower, a ship that would become symbolic of religious freedom and a new beginning in the New World. The journey they undertook was not just a physical one. It was a voyage driven by a deep spiritual yearning, the desire for freedom, and the pursuit of a life unburdened by the religious persecution they had faced in England. The Pilgrims' background and motivation. The Pilgrims, or Separatists, were a group of religious dissenters who had separated from the Church of England. In the early 1600s, England was embroiled in intense religious conflict, with the Church of England's authority and its beliefs enforced by the monarchy. The Pilgrims, in contrast, believed in a more personal relationship with God and rejected the hierarchical structure of the Church of England. They wanted to establish their own churches, free from the interference of the state. Initially, many of these separatists sought refuge in Holland in 1608, where they could practice their faith without fear of persecution. While life in Holland was more tolerant, the Pilgrims soon faced new challenges. They found themselves in a foreign land where the language, culture, and values were vastly different. Moreover, the economic situation was difficult, and the Pilgrims were concerned about the loss of their children's English identity. They feared that the younger generation would assimilate into Dutch society and abandon their traditional faith. So they turned their eyes across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, where they hoped to build a society based on their religious beliefs, free from interference, and secure a future for their descendants. The Mayflower and the Voyage. The Pilgrims' journey to the New World was far from easy. After much planning and negotiation, they secured passage on two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, arranged by the Virginia Company of London. The plan was to establish a colony in Virginia, where the company had land grants. However, the Speedwell encountered leaks and had to turn back, leaving the Pilgrims with only one ship, the Mayflower, on which to complete their voyage. So they turned their eyes across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World, where they hoped to build a society based on their religious beliefs, free from interference, and secure a future for their descendants. The Mayflower and the Voyage. The Pilgrims' journey to the New World was far from easy. After much planning and negotiation, they secured passage on two ships, the Mayflower and the Speedwell, arranged by the Virginia Company of London. The plan was to establish a colony in Virginia, where the company had land grants. However, the Speedwell encountered leaks and had to turn back, leaving the Pilgrims with only one ship, the Mayflower, on which to complete their voyage. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower set sail from Plymouth, England, carrying 102 passengers, including the Pilgrims and other settlers. The journey across the Atlantic was treacherous, taking over 2 months to complete. The weather was cold and the sea conditions rough, and many passengers fell ill during the voyage. The cramped and unsanitary conditions of the ship made the journey even more grueling. Despite these hardships, the Pilgrims remained steadfast in their purpose. They believed that God was guiding their journey, and that the difficulties they faced were part of their spiritual test. The journey was a powerful test of their faith, And it was during this time that the Pilgrims would have their first experiences of living out their faith in an extreme and challenging environment. Landfall and the decision to settle. Finally, on November 9th, 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, the Mayflower reached land. However, it was not the shores of Virginia as originally planned. Instead, the ship had drifted off course and arrived at the rocky coast of what is now Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The Pilgrims were not discouraged by this unexpected turn of events, but they knew they had to make quick decisions. They had landed outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company, which meant that they did not have any legal claim to the land. This situation created a potential crisis. Without a legal framework, there would be no rules or authority to govern the settlement. However, the Pilgrims were determined to establish a functioning society, and they knew they had to act fast. On November 11th, 1620, the Pilgrims drew up a document that would guide their settlement and government. This document, known as the Mayflower Compact, was a social contract that established the principle of self-governance. It was signed by 41 of the adult male passengers and created a government based on the consent of the governed, rather than a monarchy or corporate authority. The compact stated that the signers would combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation. The Mayflower Compact is considered one of the first steps toward democratic government in the New World. It was a bold declaration of the Pilgrims' commitment to creating a society based on mutual respect, cooperation, and shared values, and it would become a model for future colonies in America. Exploration and settlement. After signing the Mayflower Compact, the Pilgrims began exploring the area around Cape Cod to find a suitable place for settlement. They sailed along the coast, looking for a location with fresh water, fertile land, and a defensible position. Eventually, they selected a site that would become Plymouth, named after the port town in England from which they had set sail. Plymouth was a natural harbor with access to the sea for fishing and transportation. The area was also surrounded by forests, providing building materials and fuel. However, while the site had many advantages, it also presented significant challenges. The land was rocky and difficult to clear, and the Pilgrims were not familiar with the terrain or climate. The harsh winter conditions would make farming and building shelter difficult. Despite these challenges, the Pilgrims were determined to make Plymouth their home. They began constructing homes, a common house for meetings, and other buildings needed for a functioning community. They also set up a fort for defense, fearing possible attacks from local Native American tribes, or from the Spanish, who were known to be hostile to English settlers. The harsh winter of 1620-1621. The Pilgrims' first winter in Plymouth was brutal. The weather was far colder than they had expected, and the settlers were ill-prepared for the harsh conditions. The colony's food supplies were quickly depleted, and many of the Pilgrims fell ill due to exposure, poor diet, and unsanitary conditions. By the end of the winter, half of the original settlers had died from illness, malnutrition, and exposure to the elements. Yet the Pilgrims remained committed to their vision of creating a society based on their religious principles. They saw their suffering as a test of their faith and many of them believed that God had a greater purpose for their journey. The survivors, though weakened, were determined to press on, relying on their faith and each other to endure. The role of Squanto and the Wampanoag tribe. In the spring of 1621, the Pilgrims were fortunate to encounter Squanto, a member of the Wampanoag tribe who had been captured and brought to England years earlier. Squanto spoke English fluently and became an invaluable guide for the Pilgrims. He taught them essential survival skills, such as how to plant corn, beans, and squash in the sandy soil. He also introduced them to the native plants and animals, which helped them build a more sustainable food supply. Squanto's knowledge of the land and his ability to communicate with the Pilgrims were crucial to their survival. Without him, it is likely that the settlement would not have survived its first year. His assistance was a clear example of the interdependence between the Pilgrims and the Native Americans during the early years of colonization. Conclusion: a new beginning. The Pilgrim settlement at Plymouth was the beginning of a new chapter in the history of America. Their commitment to religious freedom, their dedication to building a self-governed community, and their reliance on cooperation with the local Native American tribes laid the foundation for the development of future American colonies. Despite the hardships they faced, the Pilgrims succeeded in establishing a permanent settlement, one that would grow into a thriving community. The early years of Plymouth Colony were fraught with challenges, but the Pilgrims' resilience, faith, and determination helped them overcome those obstacles. They not only survived, but also laid the groundwork for the establishment of a new nation, one that would eventually grow into the United States of America. As we look back on the story of the Pilgrims and their first settlement, we are reminded of the importance of perseverance, faith, and the willingness to adapt in the face of adversity. Their story is one of struggle, hope, and the enduring human spirit to build a better future in the face of the unknown. The Pilgrims' first winter in the New World was one of the harshest periods of their lives. After the long and treacherous voyage aboard the Mayflower, the settlers had landed at Plymouth, far off course from their intended destination in Virginia. They had quickly established their settlement, but with no time to prepare for the brutal winter that lay ahead, they faced extreme hardship, illness, and a lack of resources. However, the Pilgrims' faith and unity were what kept them going through the darkest days of their survival. The arrival and initial challenges. On November 9, 1620, after more than 2 months at sea, the Pilgrims finally arrived at Cape Cod. It was far from their intended destination in Virginia, but they had no choice but to settle where they could. After exploring the area, they chose a spot for their settlement on the shores of Plymouth Harbor. With their new home selected, the Pilgrims immediately set to work, constructing makeshift shelters, a common house for meetings and religious services, and a stockade for protection. They were motivated by their strong desire to make this land their new home, despite the unknown challenges that lay ahead. The Pilgrims, most of whom had little experience with the harsh winters of New England, struggled to adapt. Their homes were rudimentary, and the wood and materials available for construction were insufficient for adequate insulation. Many of the settlers were forced to sleep on the cold ground in poorly built huts, struggling to stay warm. At night, the winds howled through the forest, creating a freezing chill that permeated their clothing and their bones. Food shortages and starvation. Food, or rather the lack of it, was one of the most pressing challenges the Pilgrims faced during the winter. When they first arrived, they had expected to find an abundance of natural resources, but reality proved far more difficult. They were far from prepared for the food shortages they would face, and their supplies quickly dwindled. In the absence of farming experience and preparation, the Pilgrims' stores of food were running low. They had brought some provisions with them: flour, peas, and salted meats. But these could only last so long. They had no way to replenish their supplies during the winter, and the deep snow made foraging for food even more difficult. In addition, the Pilgrims had to rely on hunting and fishing to supplement their diets. But they had limited knowledge of how to survive in this new environment. The rivers and streams were frozen, and hunting proved to be much harder than expected. The harsh weather conditions made it difficult for them to track animals and find food in the wilderness. As days turned into weeks, the Pilgrims found themselves hungry and weak. Their bodies, already worn out from the journey, began to show the signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. Many of them developed scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C, as their diet lacked fresh fruits and vegetables. This illness, combined with the frigid cold, created a deadly combination that left the Pilgrims vulnerable to disease. Disease and sickness. The Pilgrims also faced numerous health challenges during their first winter. The lack of proper nutrition, combined with the cold and unsanitary conditions, made the settlers highly susceptible to disease. Many of them were struck down by illnesses like dysentery, pneumonia, and other infections. In addition, the Pilgrims' shelters were cramped and poorly ventilated, creating a breeding ground for germs and bacteria. The close quarters meant that diseases spread quickly through the settlement. The settlers had no formal medical training and limited supplies of medicine. So when people fell ill, there was little they could do to treat them. The Pilgrims' strength was rapidly being depleted. Some were bedridden, unable to help with the building of homes or the gathering of food. The elderly and children were particularly vulnerable. The Pilgrims' will to survive was being tested to its limit. The death toll. By the end of the winter, more than half of the original Pilgrims had perished. Of the 102 settlers who had made the journey across the Atlantic, only about 50 remained alive by the spring. The death toll was a staggering reminder of the cost of their endeavor. Yet, despite the loss and grief, the surviving Pilgrims continued to cling to their faith. Among the dead were many of the Pilgrims' most important leaders, including William Bradford's wife, Dorothy. The loss of such key figures was a blow to the Pilgrims' leadership and morale. But Bradford, who had become the governor of Plymouth Colony, remained steadfast in his resolve to rebuild. In the face of such overwhelming loss, the Pilgrims turned to each other for support. Their strong sense of community and their shared faith helped them endure even in the darkest moments. Many believed that their suffering was a test from God, and that if they persevered, they would be rewarded. The role of the Wampanoag tribe. Amidst the suffering and hardship, the Pilgrims were fortunate to receive help from the Wampanoag tribe, which would prove to be instrumental in their survival. As the Pilgrims struggled with food shortages, the Wampanoag people, led by Chief Massasoit, began to offer them assistance. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims how to fish, hunt, and gather food in the New World. They showed them which plants were safe to eat and how to cultivate crops such as corn and beans in the unfamiliar soil. Squanto, a member of the Wampanoag tribe, played a key role in teaching the Pilgrims essential agricultural skills. Squanto, who had been captured by the English many years earlier and had learned to speak English, acted as an intermediary between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag. His knowledge of the land and his fluency in English proved invaluable to the Pilgrims as they learned how to grow crops and forage for food. In the spring of 1621, as the weather warmed and the snow melted, the Pilgrims began to plant their first crops with the help of the Wampanoag. With Squanto's guidance, they learned to plant corn, beans, and squash in the fertile soil, which would become the foundation of their food supply. The Wampanoag also provided much-needed assistance in the form of game and fish. They taught the Pilgrims how to hunt for deer and trap wild animals. This support, which continued through the spring and summer, helped the Pilgrims recover from the hardships of the winter and provided them with the resources they needed to begin rebuilding their colony. A hard-fought survival. The first winter in Plymouth was one of unimaginable hardship. The Pilgrims faced hunger, disease, and the loss of many of their fellow settlers. Yet, despite the overwhelming challenges, they endured. They were helped by the Wampanoag tribe, who shared their knowledge and resources, ensuring the survival of the Pilgrims in a foreign and difficult environment. The Pilgrims saw their survival as a testament to their faith and perseverance. They believed that God had guided them to this new land, and that, despite the suffering they had endured, they were being prepared for a greater purpose. They took solace in the knowledge that their survival, though against the odds, was a sign that they were meant to build a new society in the New World. The survivors, although weakened, continued to rebuild their homes, strengthen their community, and establish the foundations of a new life. Their strength, faith, and unity would lay the groundwork for the future of Plymouth Colony and set the stage for the broader settlement of America. Conclusion: a test of faith and resolve. The first winter in Plymouth was a period of profound loss and suffering for the Pilgrims. However, it was also a time of resilience, courage, and unity. Despite losing so many of their people, the Pilgrims remained committed to their vision of building a society based on their religious beliefs. The hardship they faced only strengthened their resolve and reinforced their faith in the divine purpose of their journey. As the spring of 1621 arrived, the Pilgrims found hope in the budding crops, the aid of the Wampanoag, and their shared determination to survive. Though the scars of the first winter remained, the Pilgrims had proven that they could withstand even the harshest challenges. The journey ahead would be long and difficult, but they now had the tools, knowledge, and faith to face whatever came next. The first winter in Plymouth had been brutal for the Pilgrims, with the death of over half of the original settlers. But as the cold months receded and the first signs of spring began to emerge, the Pilgrims found themselves at a crossroads. They had lost many of their people, Resources were scarce, and their settlement was fragile. But they had also survived the harshest tests that nature could impose. Now, with the arrival of spring, the Pilgrims faced a new set of challenges, but also the opportunity to rebuild and strengthen their new home. The relief of spring. As winter ended and the snow melted, the Pilgrims felt a sense of relief. The bitter cold that had plagued them for months finally gave way to warmer weather, and the barren landscape began to show signs of life. The frozen rivers and streams began to thaw, and the Pilgrims could once again access fresh water. This brought a sense of renewed hope, as they could now focus on the essential tasks of survival: building, planting, and securing food. The Pilgrims, who had spent the winter in small, drafty shelters, were eager to work on improving their living conditions. They began clearing more land for agriculture, repairing their homes, and strengthening the settlement's fortifications. The hard work required to make Plymouth a viable settlement did not faze them. And it was this perseverance and communal spirit that defined their resilience. The role of the Wampanoag tribe. The key to the Pilgrims' survival in the early months of their settlement was the assistance of the Wampanoag tribe, particularly Squanto. After the disastrous winter, the Pilgrims had little knowledge of farming in the New World. They needed guidance, and Squanto, who had been captured and taken to England many years before, was their lifeline. Squanto's extensive knowledge of the land and the local environment was invaluable to the Pilgrims. He taught them how to plant corn, beans, and squash, using techniques that had been passed down through generations of his people. One of the most important lessons Squanto imparted to the Pilgrims was the use of fish as fertilizer for their crops. By burying small fish like alewives alongside corn seeds, they could provide the soil with the nutrients it desperately needed. This technique was completely foreign to the Pilgrims, but it would become crucial to their success. Squanto also helped the Pilgrims with hunting and fishing, teaching them how to catch fish in the rivers and hunt deer in the surrounding forests. With his help, the Pilgrims were able to supplement their diet with fresh meat and fish, reducing the risk of starvation that had haunted them during the winter months. In addition to Squanto, the Wampanoag tribe, under the leadership of Chief Massasoit, entered into an agreement with the Pilgrims that would become foundational to the settlement's survival. On March 22, 1621, Squanto facilitated a peace treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, establishing mutual protection and a cooperative relationship. This alliance would prove essential in the early years of Plymouth Colony, providing the Pilgrims with the support they needed to navigate the challenges of their new life. The first planting and agricultural success. The arrival of spring brought with it the critical task of planting crops. The Pilgrims had very little experience with the types of crops that would thrive in the New World, and they were eager to plant as quickly as possible. They were still recovering from the devastation of the winter, but with Squanto's guidance, they planted their first fields of corn, beans, and squash. Corn became the cornerstone of the Pilgrims' agricultural efforts. The Wampanoag had taught them to plant corn alongside beans and squash, a method known as the Three Sisters planting technique. This technique was not only efficient but also sustainable. The corn provided a tall structure for the beans to climb, while the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it. The squash spread out along the ground, keeping weeds at bay and helping to retain moisture in the soil. Although the Pilgrims had limited resources, the crops they planted were beginning to grow, and they soon began to see the benefits of their efforts. The soil in the Plymouth area, though rocky and difficult to till, was rich in nutrients once properly managed. Thanks to the guidance of the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims' hard work, the first corn crop began to flourish. The plants grew tall, their golden ears of corn promising a much-needed food source. As the corn began to grow, the Pilgrims also planted other crops. Beans, peas, and squash flourished, providing variety to their diet. For the first time since arriving, the Pilgrims had hope that they could produce enough food to sustain themselves and their growing community. The role of hunting and fishing. In addition to agriculture, hunting and fishing played a crucial role in the Pilgrims' survival during the spring and summer months. The cold months of winter had made hunting difficult, but with the warmer weather, the Pilgrims were able to venture further into the surrounding forests. With Squanto's help, they learned how to track and hunt deer, wild turkeys, and other animals. The abundance of game in the area provided a welcome addition to the Pilgrims' diet, and their hunting skills grew stronger as the season progressed. Fishing, too, became a vital part of the settlement's food supply. Plymouth was located near a rich estuary, and the Pilgrims quickly learned how to catch fish from the local rivers and ponds. Herring, bass, and eels were abundant in the waters, and the Pilgrims used fishing techniques taught by the Wampanoag to gather these fish for food. Fish were particularly important in their diet, providing much-needed protein and nutrients. The first summer harvest. As the summer months unfolded, the crops that had been planted in the spring began to mature. By late summer, the Pilgrims found themselves with an abundant supply of food for the first time since their arrival in Plymouth. The corn, beans, and squash flourished in the fertile soil, and the Pilgrims harvested their first crops with pride. The harvest was modest by today's standards, but it was a significant achievement for a community that had almost been decimated by disease, malnutrition, and the cold of winter. The success of the first harvest brought a sense of accomplishment to the Pilgrims, reaffirming their belief that they were on the right path. They had managed to survive their first winter, and now they were beginning to build a future for themselves in the new world. The Pilgrims' agricultural success was a turning point in the history of Plymouth Colony. It allowed them to establish a sustainable food supply, which was essential for the survival and growth of their community. They knew that they could now begin to focus on other aspects of their settlement, building permanent homes, expanding their population, and creating a self-sufficient society. The role of faith and community. Throughout the spring and summer, the Pilgrims remained deeply committed to their faith. They held regular church services, and their community remained tightly knit. The Pilgrims saw their success in planting and harvesting as a direct result of their faith in God. They believed that God had guided them to the new world, and that their survival and success were signs of His favor. Faith played a central role in the Pilgrims' daily lives. Even as they worked hard to clear the land and tend to their crops, they always took time to give thanks to God for their survival and prosperity. Their sense of community was also crucial to their survival. The Pilgrims worked together, helped one another, and shared in the rewards of their labor. The Pilgrims' sense of purpose was driven by their religious beliefs. They did not see themselves merely as settlers. They saw their mission as one of divine providence. They were building a new society based on their religious values and beliefs, and their success was a testament to their dedication to that mission. A new beginning. By the end of the first summer, the Pilgrims had made remarkable progress in rebuilding their settlement. The crops were thriving, the food supply was increasing, and the settlement was becoming more established. The Pilgrims had not only survived their first winter, but had also laid the groundwork for a sustainable community. The successful harvest of their first crops marked the beginning of a new chapter in Plymouth Colony's history. The Pilgrims now had the resources to feed themselves and their families, and they began to plan for the future. They began building permanent homes and expanding their settlement, eager to create a lasting community. Though the Pilgrims still faced many challenges, they were no longer in the fight for mere survival. They were now building a society that could stand the test of time. The harsh lessons of the first winter had taught them the importance of community, self-reliance, and the need to adapt to the new world around them. With faith, perseverance, and cooperation, they had laid the foundation for a society that would continue to grow and thrive. The harvest celebration and Thanksgiving. As autumn approached and the harvest was complete, the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag people celebrated their success with a feast. This event, which would become known as Thanksgiving, marked the culmination of the Pilgrims' hard work and the beginning of a new relationship between the settlers and the Native Americans. The feast was a celebration of survival, cooperation, and the fruits of their labor. The Pilgrims invited Chief Massasoit and his people to join in the celebration, sharing their food and giving thanks for their bounty. The feast included corn, venison, wild turkey, fish, and various fruits and vegetables, foods that would come to symbolize the Pilgrims' success in the New World. The first Thanksgiving was not only a celebration of the harvest, but also a reminder of the Pilgrims' commitment to building a community based on mutual respect and cooperation. It was a moment to reflect on the challenges they had overcome and to give thanks for the opportunities that lay ahead. Growth, governance, and the fragile balance. The success of the Pilgrims' first spring and summer did not mark the end of their struggle. It marked the beginning of a far more complex phase of their existence. By the autumn of 1621, Plymouth Colony had survived its most immediate threat, extinction. Yet survival alone was not enough. The settlers now faced the enormous task of transforming a fragile outpost into a functioning, enduring society. This required not only food and shelter, but also governance, law, labor organization, social discipline, and a delicate balance in their relationship with the native peoples who had helped them survive. From survival to stability. During the early months, The Pilgrims had lived in a state of constant emergency. Every decision was about staying alive. But with a successful harvest behind them, their thinking began to change. They started asking longer-term questions. How should land be distributed? How should disputes be resolved? How would future generations live in this new land? Governor William Bradford, who emerged as the colony's central leader, understood that discipline and structure were essential. The Pilgrims believed that disorder was not merely a social problem but a spiritual one. To them, a well-governed society reflected God's will, while chaos invited divine punishment. Thus, governance became as important as farming, the Mayflower Compact in practice. The Mayflower Compact, signed before the Pilgrims even stepped ashore, now moved from theory into daily practice. It was a simple document, but revolutionary for its time. It asserted that laws would be made for the general good, and that all signers agreed to obey them. In Plymouth, governance was participatory, but not democratic in the modern sense. Only adult male church members could vote, and leadership roles were often filled by respected elders. Still, compared to European monarchies, the colony system was remarkably egalitarian. Leaders were chosen, not born into power, and could be replaced if they failed the community. Town meetings became the heart of colonial life. In these gatherings, land boundaries were discussed, work assignments organized, and punishments decided. The Pilgrims believed that open discussion, within strict moral boundaries, was essential to maintaining unity. Land, labor, and a hard lesson. One of the colony's earliest experiments nearly led to disaster. Inspired by ideals of Christian equality, the Pilgrims initially held land in common. Everyone worked together, and all food was shared equally. In theory, this reflected spiritual brotherhood. In practice, it led to resentment. Some colonists worked harder than others. Younger, stronger men felt exploited. Women resented being forced to cook and clean for other families. Productivity declined. Hunger threatened to return. Bradford later wrote that this system made confusion and discontent. By 1623, the colony abandoned communal farming and assigned private plots to individual families. The change was immediate and dramatic. Productivity increased, motivation returned, and food supplies stabilized. This shift marked a critical ideological turning point. While the Pilgrims valued community, they learned that personal responsibility was essential for survival. This balance between collective values and individual labor would become a defining feature of American society. Religion as law and identity. Religion was not a private matter in Plymouth. It was the foundation of law, identity, and daily life. Church attendance was mandatory. Blasphemy, drunkenness, adultery, and laziness were not just sins, but crimes. The Pilgrims believed they were living in a covenant with God. If they obeyed His laws, they would prosper. If they failed, disaster would follow. This belief created intense social pressure to conform. Dissent was dangerous, not only spiritually, but socially. Children were raised under strict discipline. Education focused heavily on reading the Bible. Leisure activities were discouraged, especially those associated with English corruption, such as theater or gambling. Yet within this rigidity was a powerful sense of purpose. The Pilgrims did not see themselves as refugees. They saw themselves as builders of a godly society meant to serve as an example to the world. The Wampanoag Alliance, Trust and Tension. The alliance with the Wampanoag Confederacy, led by Chief Massasoit, remained crucial during these years. The treaty between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag was based on mutual benefit. The Pilgrims gained protection and knowledge. The Wampanoag gained a strategic ally against rival tribes. Trade flourished. Corn, furs, and tools were exchanged. Communication improved through interpreters like Squanto, whose role became increasingly complex. While Squanto was indispensable, his position between two worlds created tension. He sometimes manipulated information to increase his own influence, which later caused mistrust among the Wampanoag. Despite cooperation, the relationship was fragile. Cultural misunderstandings were frequent. The Pilgrims viewed land as property to be owned. The Wampanoag saw it as a shared resource. Each new fence, each cleared field, subtly shifted the balance of power. The Pilgrims were few in number, but they represented something far larger, a permanent European presence. The Wampanoag sensed this, even if they could not yet see the scale of what was coming. Defense and fear. Fear was a constant undercurrent in Plymouth. The Pilgrims knew they were vulnerable to disease, to famine, and to attack. They built a fortified hill overlooking the settlement, complete with cannons. Every man was required to train with weapons. Yet the fear was not only external. The Pilgrims feared moral decay, divine punishment, and internal division. Leaders believed that unity could only be preserved through vigilance and discipline. This fear shaped their worldview. Outsiders were viewed with suspicion. New settlers were carefully evaluated. Religious differences were not tolerated easily, a contradiction that would later shape American history in complex ways. Growth and new arrivals. As news of Plymouth's survival spread, more settlers began to arrive from England. Some shared the Pilgrims' beliefs. Others came for economic opportunity. Each arrival changed the colony's character. The population grew slowly but steadily. With growth came new challenges. Land disputes, food distribution, and social hierarchy. Leaders struggled to maintain unity among people who did not all share the same spiritual intensity. Still, growth was seen as a sign of God's blessing. The colony expanded outward, clearing forests and establishing new farms. The wilderness slowly receded, replaced by fields, paths, and homes. Women, family, and survival women played a crucial but often overlooked role in the colony's survival. They cooked, preserved food, raised children, tended gardens, and cared for the sick. Many had lost husbands during the first winter and bore the burden of rebuilding family life under extraordinary pressure. Marriage was encouraged, not only for companionship, but for stability. Large families were seen as a blessing. Children were expected to contribute from a young age, working alongside adults in fields and homes. Family became the core unit of society, replacing the communal structures that had failed. This shift reinforced private property, inheritance, and long-term planning. A society takes shape. By the mid-1620s, Plymouth was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning society. Roads connected homes, laws governed behavior, crops were reliable, trade networks extended beyond the colony. Yet beneath this success lay unresolved tensions, with native peoples, with newcomers, and within their own beliefs. The Pilgrims had escaped persecution, but they had not escaped human nature. They believed they were building a city upon a hill, watched by God and the world. That belief gave them strength, but also rigidity. The quiet turning point. Part 4 ends not with celebration, but with quiet transformation. The Pilgrims had survived. They had adapted. They had learned hard lessons about labor, governance, and coexistence. But survival came at a cost. The choices they made about land, faith, and power would echo far beyond Plymouth. They laid foundations not only for a colony, but for a nation that would wrestle for centuries with the same questions they faced in these early years. Freedom and control, faith and tolerance, cooperation and conquest. The seeds were planted, not only in the soil, but in history itself. Expansion, unease, and the first shadows of conflict. By the late 1620s, Plymouth Colony had crossed a quiet but decisive threshold. It was no longer a fragile experiment clinging to survival. It had become something far more dangerous and far more permanent. Fields now stretched beyond the original settlement. Homes stood where forests once ruled. Children were being born who had never seen England and would never call it home. The Pilgrims had begun to take root in the land, and with that rootedness came consequences they could neither fully foresee nor entirely control. A colony begins to spread. The land surrounding Plymouth was rich but limited. As families grew and new settlers arrived, pressure mounted to expand outward. Small satellite farms were established several miles from the original settlement. What had once been wilderness became farmland, marked by fences, paths, and boundary stones. To the Pilgrims, this expansion felt natural, even necessary. Land was a gift from God, meant to be used productively. Clearing forests and planting crops were acts of obedience, not aggression. Each new field represented security against hunger and dependence. To the native peoples, however, the expansion felt very different. The land had never been empty. It had always been lived upon, hunted across, and spiritually inhabited. Forests were not wastelands. They were food stores, medicine cabinets, and sacred spaces. As English farms spread, traditional hunting grounds shrank. Game became scarce. Seasonal migration patterns were disrupted. No declaration of war was made. No battle lines were drawn. But a quiet displacement had begun, changing balance of power. The alliance between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag Confederacy still held, but it was no longer equal. When the treaty was signed, the English were weak and few. Now their numbers were growing, their defenses stronger, their confidence unmistakable. Firearms shifted the balance. Even a small number of muskets changed the nature of power in the region. The Pilgrims trained constantly, drilling with weapons, building stockades, and maintaining watch rotations. What had once been precaution began to look like preparation. The Wampanoag leadership understood this shift. They had allied with the English partly to protect themselves from rival tribes. But alliances are never static. As one partner grows stronger, the relationship changes or breaks. Squanto's death and a broken bridge. The death of Squanto marked a turning point few fully recognized at the time. He had been more than a translator. He was a bridge between worlds. His knowledge of English culture, combined with his deep understanding of native traditions, allowed him to smooth misunderstandings before they became crises. With Squanto gone, communication became fragile. Misinterpretations increased. Small disputes escalated. Intentions were questioned. Where once there had been negotiation, now there was suspicion, disease, and the invisible catastrophe. Long before open conflict erupted, disease continued to devastate native communities. European illnesses, smallpox, measles, influenza, spread faster than any army. Entire villages disappeared within a generation. The Pilgrims often interpreted this tragedy through a religious lens. Some believed it was divine providence, clearing the land for Christian settlement. Others were troubled by the suffering but felt powerless to intervene. From the native perspective, the losses were apocalyptic. Elders died. Oral histories vanished. Leadership structures collapsed. Societies weakened not by war, but by microbes no one could see. This silent catastrophe reshaped the region more profoundly than any treaty or battle. New settlers, new attitudes. As Plymouth stabilized, a new kind of settler arrived. Not all were driven by religious devotion. Some sought land, trade, or opportunity. These newcomers did not share the Pilgrims' original caution or humility. Where the first settlers had feared the wilderness, the newcomers saw profit. Trade expanded rapidly. Furs became currency. Timber was harvested aggressively. Rivers were dammed. Economic logic began to replace spiritual restraint. This shift unsettled the original Pilgrims. They worried that moral discipline was weakening. Wealth, they believed, invited corruption. Yet they also benefited from trade and expansion. The contradiction grew sharper with each passing year. The weight of authority governance became more complex as the population grew. Laws multiplied. Punishments hardened. Leaders struggled to maintain order in a society that prized obedience but was becoming increasingly diverse. Dissent, once rare, began to surface. Some settlers questioned strict religious rules. Others challenged land distribution. A few openly criticized leadership. The response was firm. Unity, leaders believed, was non-negotiable. Disagreement threatened not just order, but God's favor. Thus, the colony grew more confident and more rigid. Land as ownership versus land as relationship. One of the deepest, most irreconcilable differences between English settlers and native peoples lay in how land itself was understood. To the Pilgrims, land was property. It could be owned, measured, bought, sold, inherited. Boundaries defined responsibility and rights. To native societies, land was relational. It belonged to no one and everyone. Use changed with seasons. Boundaries were fluid, shaped by tradition rather than documents. Every English fence was a declaration of exclusion. Every deed was incomprehensible to those who did not share the same worldview. This was not merely a misunderstanding. It was a collision of civilizations. Land as ownership versus land as relationship. One of the deepest, most irreconcilable differences between English settlers and native peoples lay in how land itself was understood. To the Pilgrims, land was property. It could be owned, measured, bought, sold, inherited. Boundaries defined responsibility and rights. To native societies, land was relational. It belonged to no one and everyone. Use changed with seasons. Boundaries were fluid, shaped by tradition rather than documents. Every English fence was a declaration of exclusion. Every deed was incomprehensible to those who did not share the same worldview. This was not merely a misunderstanding. It was a collision of civilizations. The quiet militarization. Though Plymouth was not at war, it increasingly behaved like a society preparing for one. Fortifications were improved, ammunition stockpiled. Young men were trained from adolescence. Fear shaped policy. Leaders remembered the vulnerability of the first winter. They vowed never to be helpless again. Yet fear also bred aggression. Defensive readiness easily became preemptive suspicion. The line between protection and provocation blurred. Children of the colony. A new generation was growing up. Children born on American soil. They spoke English, but with different rhythms. They knew forests better than streets. England was a story, not a memory. These children would inherit not only land, but unresolved tensions. They would grow into a world where expansion was expected, resistance inevitable. History was moving forward, quietly, relentlessly. The calm before open conflict. By the early 1630s, Plymouth stood at a moment of uneasy calm. The colony was stable, food was secure, governance functioned. But beneath the surface, fault lines deepened. Native alliances weakened. Land pressures intensified. Cultural misunderstandings hardened into resentment. The Pilgrims had survived the wilderness. Now they faced a far more complex challenge, living with the consequences of permanence. The first shadows of conflict stretched long across the fields they had cleared. They did not yet know it, but the age of coexistence was ending. The breaking of alliances and the road toward war history rarely announces its turning points with thunder. More often, it changes direction quietly, through small decisions, wounded pride, fear left unspoken, and trust slowly eroded. By the early 1630s, Plymouth Colony stood precisely at such a moment. The outward appearance of peace remained, yet beneath the surface, the alliance that had once saved the Pilgrims was unraveling. What followed would reshape New England forever. A world no longer balanced. The alliance between the English settlers and the Wampanoag Confederacy had been born of necessity. When it was signed, both sides needed one another. The English were weak and vulnerable. The Wampanoag were threatened by rival tribes and devastating disease. But alliances depend on balance, and balance had vanished. The English population was growing rapidly. New settlements sprang up across Massachusetts Bay. More ships arrived. More land was claimed. More forests fell. What had once been a fragile foothold was becoming a network of permanent colonies. For the native peoples, the land was shrinking. Hunting grounds disappeared. Sacred spaces were fenced. Rivers were diverted. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Chief Massasoit and a fading era. Chief Massasoit, who had once welcomed the Pilgrims as allies, grew old during these years. He had watched his world change faster than any generation before him. Disease had killed thousands of his people. The English had multiplied beyond all expectation. Massasoit understood something the English largely did not. Coexistence could only last as long as restraint existed on both sides. And restraint was disappearing. When Massasoit died, leadership passed to his sons. They inherited not a stable alliance, but a fragile, uncertain peace built on fading trust. Cultural distance widens. The English and native peoples had never truly understood one another. But earlier, necessity had masked the gap. Now misunderstandings became open grievances. English settlers believed they had legally purchased land. Native leaders believed they had granted temporary use rights. When settlers returned with documents claiming permanent ownership, outrage followed. English courts punished native individuals under English law, laws they had never agreed to. Native justice systems were ignored. Authority was being imposed, not shared. The English saw this as order. The native peoples saw it as religion as justification. As tensions rose, English settlers increasingly interpreted events through a religious lens. They believed they were chosen, guided, protected. Every success confirmed divine favor. Every native misfortune was viewed by some as evidence of God's will. This belief hardened attitudes. Compassion weakened. Warnings were ignored. Few settlers openly desired war, but many believed that if war came, it would be justified. The arrival of more colonies, Plymouth was no longer alone. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, far larger and wealthier, was expanding aggressively. Its leaders were less cautious than the Pilgrims had once been. Their vision was expansive, confident, uncompromising. The arrival of powerful neighboring colonies changed everything. Native leaders realized that Plymouth was only the beginning. The English were not guests. They were a tide. Fear spread quietly through native communities. Councils were held. Messengers traveled between tribes. Old rivalries were reconsidered. Survival required unity. Metacom steps forward. One figure emerged from this uncertainty. Metacom, later known to the English as King Philip. He was intelligent, observant, and deeply aware of the danger his people faced. Metacom had grown up watching the English transform the land. He spoke English. He understood their customs. He also understood that accommodation had limits. Unlike his father, Metacom believed that continued submission would lead to extinction. Resistance, he believed, was no longer optional. The weight of humiliation tensions escalated through small humiliations. English authorities demanded native leaders submit to English courts. Weapons were confiscated. Movement was restricted. Each act reinforced the same message. Power had shifted, and it was not returning. To the English, these were precautions. To the native peoples, they were warnings. The collapse of trust. The final thread of trust snapped not in battle, but in fear. Rumors spread, some true, many exaggerated. English settlers feared coordinated native attacks. Native communities feared English preemptive strikes. In this atmosphere, suspicion became self-fulfilling. A single accusation could ignite violence. A single death could demand revenge. A world poised on the edge. By the early 1670s, New England existed in a state of uneasy silence. Trade continued. Treaties remained on paper. But everyone sensed that peace was no longer secure. Children had grown up knowing only expansion and fear. Elders remembered cooperation, but their voices were fading. The English had built homes, farms, churches. The native peoples had lost villages, land, and lives. Two worlds now occupied the same ground, but no longer the same future. The inevitable path. History teaches a cruel lesson. When power expands without restraint, conflict follows. The English colonies believed they were securing their survival. Native leaders believed they were fighting for existence itself. There could be no compromise between those visions. The road toward war was not chosen in a single moment. It was paved slowly by fear, certainty, misunderstanding, and ambition. And soon, the silence would break. The war that changed. New England. Forever war did not arrive in New England with a declaration or a marching army. It arrived quietly, in fear-filled whispers, broken trust, and a single spark that ignited years of buried tension. When violence finally erupted, it was swift, brutal, and transformative. The conflict that followed, later known as King Philip's War, would become one of the bloodiest and most devastating wars in early American history, measured not by numbers alone, but by its lasting consequences. The first spark. In 1675, a native Christian convert named John Sassamon was found dead in a frozen pond near Plymouth Colony. Sassamon had served as an interpreter and advisor, moving between English and native worlds. Before his death, he had warned English authorities that Metacom was preparing for war. When 3 Wampanoag men were arrested, tried under English law, and executed for Sassamon's murder, the message was unmistakable. English courts claimed authority over native lives. To Metacom and many native leaders, this was no longer coexistence. It was subjugation. Within weeks, the fragile peace collapsed. Fire and retaliation. The first attacks came suddenly. Wampanoag warriors struck English settlements along the frontier, burning homes, destroying crops, and killing settlers. Panic spread rapidly. Communities that had lived in relative security now found themselves vulnerable. English militias mobilized in response, launching retaliatory raids on native villages. These attacks were often indiscriminate, destroying food stores and homes, ensuring starvation even for non-combatants. The war quickly became total. Villages burned, families fled, fields turned to ash. No one remained untouched. A war without front lines. King Philip's War was unlike European wars. There were no clear battlefields, no uniformed armies, no predictable engagements. Instead, the conflict was fluid and terrifying. Native warriors used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, night raids, sudden strikes followed by disappearance into forests they knew intimately. English militias, trained for conventional warfare, struggled to adapt. Fear became constant. Every forest hid danger. Every shadow carried threat. Settlements fortified themselves, clustering into defensive towns. Travel became deadly. Trade collapsed. Hunger spread. The cost to native societies. Though the English suffered greatly, native communities bore the war's heaviest burden. Villages were destroyed. Crops burned. Entire tribes displaced. Disease followed starvation. Elders died. Oral traditions vanished. Leadership structures fractured. Some native groups attempted neutrality. Others were forced into alliances they did not choose. Survival often meant choosing sides, or being crushed between them. The war did not unite native peoples as Metacom had hoped. Instead, it exposed divisions and exhaustion already deepened by decades of loss, faith, and fear among the English. For English settlers, The war became a spiritual crisis. Ministers preached that the conflict was God's punishment for moral failings. Days of fasting and prayer were declared. Fear hardened belief. Native peoples were increasingly portrayed as agents of darkness, enemies of divine order. Mercy faded. Violence escalated. Captured native prisoners were sold into slavery or executed. Entire communities were erased from maps. The moral certainty that had sustained the settlers now justified atrocities. The fall of Metacom. By 1676, Metacom was hunted relentlessly. Former allies betrayed him. His support collapsed under starvation and loss. When Metacom was finally killed, his body was mutilated. His head was displayed publicly for years as a warning. The message was clear. Resistance would not be remembered as heroism, but as defiance crushed. Aftermath, a changed world. The war ended, but nothing returned to what it had been. Thousands were dead, dozens of towns destroyed. Native power in southern New England was broken. Survivors were enslaved, displaced, or forced onto marginal lands. English settlements expanded rapidly into the vacuum left behind. The war reshaped New England's identity. Fear became policy. Expansion accelerated. Coexistence was replaced. A legacy of silence. King Philip's War faded from popular memory, overshadowed by later conflicts. But its impact was profound. It taught colonists that violence worked. It taught native peoples that survival required impossible choices. It taught future generations that expansion would come at terrible cost. The land bore the scars long after the fires died. Forests grew back. Fields were replanted. But something irreparable had been lost. Trust, balance, the possibility of shared futures. History moves forward. By the war's end, the New England colonies stood stronger, wealthier, and more confident. They believed they had secured their destiny. Yet the methods they used would echo through centuries. The story of America was no longer just one of settlement. It was one of conquest. And the consequences were only beginning. After the war, a land without resistance. When the fires of King Philip's War finally died out, New England entered a silence unlike any it had known before. It was not the silence of peace, nor the silence of healing. It was the silence left behind when resistance has been crushed and voices have been removed from the land itself. The war had ended, but its aftermath reshaped everything. How land was taken, how power was exercised, and how memory itself would be controlled. A landscape emptied. Entire native villages lay abandoned. Fields that had once fed generations were overgrown or scorched. Paths used for centuries disappeared beneath expanding English farms. Where life had once moved with seasons and ceremony, fences now stood. To English settlers, this emptiness looked like opportunity. Land that had been contested was now available. With native resistance broken, expansion accelerated. Settlers moved outward with confidence, claiming territory that only a few years earlier would have required negotiation or fear. The wilderness was no longer feared. It was possessed. The survivors. Those native people who survived the war faced impossible futures. Many were enslaved and shipped to distant colonies. Others were forced into marginal lands where farming was difficult and resources scarce. Communities were fragmented beyond repair. Identity itself became fragile. Languages faded. Ceremonies ended. Oral histories broke mid-sentence. Survival often required assimilation, adopting English customs, religion, and law. Resistance, even cultural resistance, was dangerous. The war had not merely defeated native peoples militarily. It had dismantled their ability to exist on their own terms. The English sense of victory. For the English colonies, the war was remembered as a hard-won triumph. Though losses were severe, the outcome reinforced a powerful belief. Expansion was inevitable, and resistance futile. This belief reshaped colonial psychology. Fear receded, confidence grew, moral doubt vanished. The lesson settlers carried forward was simple and dangerous. When challenged, force worked. Expansion without restraint. With native resistance shattered, the pace of settlement increased dramatically. New towns were founded inland. Roads pushed through forests. Rivers were harnessed for mills. Trade expanded beyond survival into profit. Land speculation emerged. Wealth concentrated. Hierarchies hardened. The earlier pilgrim ideals, humility, restraint, communal discipline, began to fade. A new generation, born after the war, knew only dominance. To them, the land had always been theirs. Religion after the war. The war transformed religion itself. Before, faith had emphasized survival and moral purity. After, it increasingly justified authority. Ministers preached that the victory was proof of divine favor. The belief that God had chosen the English hardened into certainty. Dissent became dangerous not only politically, but spiritually. This certainty narrowed compassion. Suffering was interpreted as deserved. Loss was reframed as providence. Faith became less about humility and more about entitlement. The rewriting of memory. As years passed, the war faded from living memory, but not from influence. Stories changed. The complexity of the conflict was simplified. Native peoples were remembered as obstacles rather than nations. English violence was reframed as defense. Silence replaced nuance. Children learned a history where expansion was natural and necessary. The land's earlier inhabitants were reduced to shadows. What is forgotten can be repeated. A generation without witness. The children growing up after the war had not seen native villages thriving. They had not known cooperation or alliance. They inherited a world already reshaped by conquest. To them, displacement was invisible. Loss was abstract. Dominance was normal. This generational shift mattered deeply. It ensured that future conflicts would unfold with less hesitation and less remorse. Economic transformation. With security came commerce. Farming moved beyond subsistence. Surpluses were sold. Trade routes expanded. Markets replaced mutual aid. Wealth accumulation began to define success. Those with land prospered. Those without struggled. Class divisions sharpened. The colony that had once feared starvation now feared instability, not from hunger, but from inequality. Law as control legal systems grew more complex and more punitive. Laws governed land ownership, labor, morality, and movement. Justice favored settlers. Authority favored expansion. The rule of law became a tool of control rather than protection for all. This pattern would repeat across centuries. The illusion of peace. Outwardly, New England appeared calm. Settlements flourished. Churches filled. Roads connected communities. But peace built on silence is unstable. Native resistance had been crushed, but not erased. Trauma lingered. Displacement continued. Cultural survival persisted quietly. And beyond New England, other native nations watched carefully, learning their own lessons from what had occurred. The shape of the future. The aftermath of the war shaped everything that followed. Expansion without negotiation, authority without restraint, memory without accountability. The English colonies had crossed a moral threshold. They were no longer simply settlers. They were colonizers. And colonization, once normalized, becomes self-perpetuating. History moves on. By the early 1700s, New England was firmly English in structure, culture, and power. The land bore English names. Laws followed English models. Religion shaped public life. Yet beneath this order lay buried histories. Fields covered villages. Churches stood near forgotten graves. Roads followed ancient paths without remembering who first walked them. The land remembered, even when people did not. A quiet truth for Torsa, part, ends not with battle but with transformation. The war had ended, but its consequences deepened. Expansion continued. Power consolidated. Memory narrowed. The world the Pilgrims had entered no longer existed. And the world they created would soon give rise to conflicts far larger than they could imagine. From colony to confidence. The birth of a colonial identity. By the early 18th century, New England had entered a new phase of existence. The era of desperate survival had faded into memory, and the age of violent resistance had largely ended. What replaced them was something quieter, subtler, and ultimately more powerful. Confidence. The English colonies no longer saw themselves as fragile extensions of Europe. They were becoming something distinct, self-aware, rooted, and increasingly independent in spirit, even if not yet in name. This transformation did not happen suddenly. It unfolded slowly, shaped by land ownership, generational change, and the quiet normalization of power. A generation that knew only America. The children born after King Philip's War grew up in a world already remade. They did not remember native villages as neighbors. They did not fear starvation as their parents had. England, for them, was distant. A place of stories and ancestry, not lived experience. They spoke English, but with different rhythms. They worked land their families had owned for decades. Their sense of belonging was tied not to a crown across the ocean, but to soil beneath their feet. This generational shift mattered deeply. Identity no longer rested solely on faith or survival. It began to rest on place. America was no longer a refuge. It was home. Land as legacy land ownership became the foundation of status and stability. Families passed farms from one generation to the next. Boundaries hardened. Deeds replaced memory. With land came inheritance, and with inheritance came permanence. This permanence reshaped thinking. Settlers no longer asked how to endure winter. They asked how to expand harvests, increase profits, and secure futures for grandchildren not yet born. The mindset of settlers evolved into the mindset of proprietors. The rise of local power. As colonies stabilized, local governance gained authority. Town councils, courts, and assemblies handled daily affairs with minimal interference from England. Decisions about taxation, defense, and trade were made locally by people who lived with the consequences. This autonomy bred confidence. While colonists still identified as English subjects, They increasingly believed they understood their world better than distant officials ever could. Orders from across the Atlantic felt slow, disconnected, and impractical. The seeds of resistance were being planted, not in anger, but in habit. Economic transformation. The colonial economy expanded beyond subsistence farming. Trade networks grew. Timber, fish, grain, and livestock flowed outward. Manufactured goods flowed inward. Money replaced barter. Markets replaced mutual aid. Prosperity brought opportunity, but also inequality. Wealth concentrated among landowners and merchants. Poorer settlers struggled to keep pace. Social divisions sharpened. The moral discipline of the early pilgrims softened under the weight of commerce. Wealth was no longer viewed with suspicion. It was increasingly seen as evidence of success. Religion loses its absolute hold. Faith remained central to colonial life, but its role began to change. The intense spiritual urgency of the early settlers faded. Church attendance remained high, but belief became more routine, less consuming. For some, religion became tradition rather than transformation. This shift unsettled ministers, who worried that moral decay followed prosperity. Sermons grew more urgent, warning against complacency and pride. Yet the world had changed. The colonies were no longer living on the edge of extinction. Fear no longer shaped faith as it once had. Memory and myth. As time passed, the story of early settlement hardened into myth. The suffering of the first winter became heroic legend. Cooperation with native peoples was remembered selectively. Violence was softened or justified. History became narrative rather than truth. Children learned simplified stories, stories of bravery and divine favor. The complexity of conquest, displacement, and loss faded from view. What a society remembers shapes what it becomes. A quiet sense of difference. Colonists began to notice differences between themselves and those in England. They worked harder, they believed. They governed themselves more efficiently. They lived closer to danger and consequence. This sense of difference was not yet rebellion, but it was distinction. They were English, but not entirely. Expansion continues westward. As coastal lands filled, settler pushed inland. Forests fell, new towns formed. The frontier shifted westward, carrying with it the same patterns of displacement and dominance seen before. Native resistance still existed beyond the margins, but it no longer shaped colonial policy. Expansion was assumed, not debated. The lessons of earlier wars had been absorbed and normalized. Education and authority. Education expanded, particularly among boys. Literacy rates were high. Reading scripture was expected. Writing and arithmetic supported trade and governance. Knowledge became power. Those who could read contracts, interpret laws, and navigate bureaucracy gained advantage. Authority became institutional rather than purely moral. The colony matured. The illusion of stability. Outwardly, colonial society appeared stable and orderly. Farms thrived, towns functioned, trade flowed. But beneath this stability lay unresolved contradictions. Freedom coexisted with exclusion. Faith coexisted with material ambition. Self-rule coexisted with imperial authority. These contradictions did not yet explode, but they accumulated pressure. The shape of an emerging identity. By the early 1700s, something new had formed. Not a nation, but a consciousness. The colonists saw themselves as builders of a world shaped by effort, discipline, and ownership. They believed in order, progress, and entitlement. They did not yet call themselves Americans, but they were becoming something England did not fully recognize. History holds its breath. Part 9 ends in a moment of quiet confidence. The colonies were stable. Expansion continued. Prosperity grew. Yet confidence carries risk. When people believe success is natural and permanent, they stop questioning its cost. The land was settled. The society was formed. The identity was emerging. And soon, that identity would begin to challenge the very empire that had given it birth. England ruled in name. The colonies ruled in practice. From this quiet imbalance grew a transformation neither side fully understood at the time. Authority, when exercised from afar, loses its immediacy. Orders arrive late. Context is missing. Urgency fades. In the colonies, this distance did not produce chaos. It produced habit. Colonists learned to govern themselves not because they wished to rebel, but because waiting was impossible. The habit of self-rule. Every winter storm, failed harvest, border dispute, or local conflict forced colonial leaders to act independently. There was no time to consult London when crops failed or when frontier settlements faced danger. Decisions were made locally, solutions improvised, responsibility accepted. Over decades, this necessity hardened into expectation. Colonial assemblies debated taxes, raised militias, built roads, regulated trade, and enforced laws. Governors sent from England often discovered that real power did not rest in their offices but in town meetings, merchant councils, and local courts. Authority existed, but it was negotiated, not imposed. What began as temporary autonomy slowly became normal life. England as an abstraction. To many colonists, England became an idea rather than a presence. It was the source of laws, titles, and traditions, but not daily reality. Few colonists had ever seen London. Few were still expected to return. England existed in letters, portraits of kings, official seals, and distant wars. It did not exist in frozen fields, frontier cabins, or town halls thick with argument. As lived experience diverged, emotional loyalty weakened, not through anger, but through irrelevance. Trade. Without permission, imperial trade laws attempted to control colonial commerce, but enforcement was inconsistent. Ports were busy, coastlines were long. Smuggling became routine. Merchants learned that profit often required bending rules. Customs officials were bribed. Paperwork was falsified. Everyone knew. Few objected. Illegality, practiced widely and punished rarely, lost its moral weight. When laws are distant and enforcement uneven, obedience becomes optional. The language of rights colonists did not see themselves as lawless. On the contrary, they believed deeply in law, English law. They studied legal tradition, cited precedent, and demanded rights guaranteed to English subjects. This belief created a dangerous contradiction. They saw themselves as loyal subjects. They also saw themselves as entitled to representation, fairness, and local authority. When imperial policy ignored these expectations, colonists did not feel rebellious. They felt wronged. War and unequal burden. Imperial wars brought this contradiction into sharper focus. Colonists were asked to fight wars rooted in European rivalries, conflicts they had not chosen, in lands they barely understood. They supplied troops. They supplied food. They supplied money. Yet decisions were made an ocean away. Colonists returned from war with experience, confidence, and resentment. They had proven their ability to defend themselves. They had also learned that Britain needed them more than it admitted. Power, once demonstrated, is not easily forgotten. A new confidence. By the mid-18th century, the colonies were no longer insecure outposts. They were prosperous, populous, and organized. Cities grew, education expanded, newspapers circulated ideas rapidly. Colonists debated politics openly. They criticized officials. They questioned policy. None of this felt revolutionary. It felt reasonable. They were managing their own lives. They wanted a say in decisions that shaped them. England tightens control. Ironically, as colonial confidence grew, Britain sought to reassert authority. Wars had drained the treasury. The empire needed revenue. The colonies appeared wealthy and under-regulated. New taxes were proposed, new regulations enforced. Oversight increased. From London's perspective, this was sensible governance. From the colony's perspective, it felt sudden, intrusive, and unjust. The habit of self-rule clashed with renewed control. The emotional break. The most profound shift was not political. It was psychological. Colonists no longer saw Britain as protector. They began to see it as supervisor. The relationship had changed, but neither side had acknowledged it openly. Britain still spoke the language of authority. The colonies had learned the language of autonomy. Two realities now existed at once. The calm before confrontation. There was no rebellion yet, no calls for independence, no unified resistance. But the ground had shifted. Authority without presence felt hollow. Obedience without voice felt unreasonable. Distance had reshaped power. The empire still ruled on paper. The colonies ruled in practice. History was no longer waiting for permission. If you want, I can continue directly into the next section. Taxes, tension, and the first open resistance distance alone does not cause rebellion. It creates space. Space in which expectations grow, habits form, and identities change. By the time Britain decided to tighten its grip on the colonies, that space had already been filled with something new. Confidence. The colonists did not see themselves as dependents anymore. They saw themselves as contributors. And when contributors are treated like subjects, resentment begins to harden into resistance. The empire's financial wake-up call. Britain emerged from a series of expensive imperial wars, exhausted and in debt. Maintaining armies, navies, and overseas territories had drained the treasury. From London's perspective, the solution was obvious. The colonies should help pay for their own defense. On paper, this made sense. The colonies were growing wealthier. Trade flourished. Land expanded. Britain had protected colonial interests against rival European powers. Why shouldn't the colonies share the cost? But logic written in ledgers does not always survive contact with lived reality. Taxation. Without habit, for decades, the colonies had taxed themselves. Local assemblies raised funds, decided how money was spent, and debated every burden. Taxes were familiar, but imposed taxes were not. When Britain introduced new revenue measures, colonists were not angered by money alone. They were angered by process. The question was simple and deeply unsettling. who had the right to decide? Colonists ask this not as radicals, but as English subjects raised on the idea that taxes required consent. Parliament argued that it represented all English subjects. Colonists replied, quietly at first, that representation without presence felt hollow. This disagreement was not yet rebellion. It was confusion turning into frustration. The language of protest resistance began cautiously. Petitions were written. Arguments were framed in legal language, not revolutionary slogans. Colonists insisted they were loyal. They protested as citizens, not rebels. Pamphlets circulated, explaining rights and precedents. Newspapers debated policy. Taverns filled with conversation. What mattered was not the volume of protest, but its tone. The colonists were not begging. They were reasoning. And reasoning implied equality. When obedience becomes negotiation, British officials underestimated this shift. They believed authority could be enforced through law alone. They did not understand that authority depends on habit and belief. In the colonies, obedience had become conditional. Merchants delayed compliance. Assemblies resisted enforcement. Local officials looked the other way. Crowds gathered, not yet violent, but visible. Each act of resistance tested boundaries. Each success emboldened the next. The empire's power still existed, but it no longer felt unquestionable. Identity crystallizes under pressure. As tension increased, colonists began to speak differently. They used the word we more often. Not we English, but we here. Shared grievance forged shared identity. People from different colonies, once divided by geography, religion, and economy, found common ground in resistance to distant authority. They began to recognize themselves as part of something larger than town or colony. Not yet a nation, but no longer fragments. Britain's miscalculation. From London, resistance looked like ingratitude. Officials believed firmness would restore order. Concessions, they feared, would invite weakness. So enforcement increased. Penalties hardened. Troops appeared. Each step intended to restore authority instead exposed its fragility. Soldiers on colonial streets did not reassure. They provoked. The emotional crossing point. At some moment, different for every colonist, loyalty quietly changed shape. It did not vanish. It was outweighed. People began to ask not, how do we remain loyal, but what do we owe, and to whom? When that question appears, history accelerates. From resistance to resolve. The colonies were still British. The crown was still recognized. No one had declared independence. But the ground beneath those truths was no longer stable. Distance had weakened authority. Taxes had revealed that weakness. Resistance had given it form. What began as disagreement was becoming confrontation. What began as habit was becoming principle. The empire had waited too long to notice how far away it had become. And the colonies, once grateful, once dependent, were beginning to imagine a future shaped by their own decisions. Not yet freedom, but no longer submission.